Salutations Rangers, General Bradley 101 back at you today with some more Da verfickte Scheiße! Wann zum Teufel, Mann? Yes. Hans, was machst du da? Ich nehme auf, verdammt! Ja, für YouTube, du Idiot. Was holt ihr? Was ist mit dem Flammenwerfer? Der hat kein Benzin mehr. Verlicht? Scheiße, die Frachtwolke lassen nicht locker. Was? Scheiße. Okay. In die Erker ist noch mehr. Hol es und unterbricht mich nicht noch einmal. Und. Sachlich, soll aufhören. Heinz Stamm soll umsonst für seine Zwaffel beziehen. Ja, ich will. Los jetzt, los. Hans sagt hallo. Hans says hello. Hi. We're talking about the Krieg today. That was weird. Anyway, right. Today we're talking about Krieg, aka World War I in space. Because people just think it's World War I in Germany. Incorrect, it's World War I as a whole. Because if you look at their uniform, they draw a lot of elements from all of the major powers during World War I. Not to mention Vrax is literally World War I in space. Anyway, we're talking about the Kriegsmen. The Death Korps of Krieg, or the Krieg Guardsmen, are a regiment of the Imperial Guard. And they are one of the elite regiments of the... When I talk about elite, I mean elite of the elite. Again, that's just all named regiments though, because you may be thinking, well, Brad, there's like 20 named regiments. 20 regiments out of 1 million? Pretty elite, at least by my books anyway. So, we're talking about Krieg today. We're going to be going over their history, some of the special formations, their overall philosophy, and just a little bit about nonsense here and there. So, first thing first, let's start at the beginning. Way back when, in the Imperium of Manton, about 32nd millennium I believe, there was a planet called Krieg. Krieg is literally war in German. For those of you who don't know. Such as always GW. However, this particular planet of Krieg was actually a paradise world. It functioned as an export world. I think it was an agri world, but I'm not entirely sure. It used to export so many things, and it made most of its income off trade, lucrative trade. And it was a paradise world to live in. The people were happy, everything was okay, everything was good. But you know, the old saying, show me a content man and I'll show you a liar. Of course, I prefer show me a lawyer and I'll show you a liar.
You will not serve combat, then you will...
But basically, though, the ruling council, known as the Council of Autochs, began to become more and more greedy and paranoid. So they began arming Vrax.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
Hanz gets the Flammenwerfer!
And increasing its defenses and its defenses and its defenses. Like, they literally spent so much of their money on defense and improving their own standing forces until the time came where they declared independence from the Imperium. Again, this was out of greed, really, but you know, really greed. I mean, yeah, the Imperium was indeed a place where it's just like they couldn't really care about you so long as you give them the title, and that's true. Imperium was kind of ass, but at the end of the day, probably greed, but yeah, it's neither here nor there. And essentially, all the loyalist guard forces that were on there were immediately ambushed by the traitors and were completely overrun, all except one hive city. And this hive city had a particular colonel in it, known as Colonel Yurton. Now, Colonel Yurton was a very interesting man. He was very astute, very devout follower of the Imperium, and he generally believed in what it stood for. And when he requested aid to the Imperium was like, you know, I'm sorry, we don't have the time or the energy or the resources, and your planet is a fortress world at this point. We cannot do anything. But you can. Followed by a little beep and nuclear launch codes.
That escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
So, Colonel Yurton, on the day of the Emperor's Ascension, which is a holiday celebrated when the Emperor got interned on the Golden Throne, which is actually when Council of Autochs had this big coup, mind you, decided to nuke everyone and everything. Literally nuke them. So, you know, you'd think that after nuking an entire, planet, people would not be up for a war. You think that they'd be like, okay, let's re-chill. Krieg's built different. And the war went on for not 1 year, not 2 years. Not 3 years, not even 5 years. Went on for 500 years. Krieg was turned into an irradiated hellscape and became a worldwide trench line. The Western Front translated planet size. That's literally what it became, not even kidding. And eventually, after 500 years, the Loyalists won, and they messaged to the Departum Munitorum and said, we, the Krieg's regiments, demand service. The Munitorum was like, okay, you guys have been in a war for 500 years. You know, well, tell you what, You can give us just one regiment. You know, your population's probably destroyed, but, you know, just one regiment, you know. The Kriegsman responded with, we have 20 full regiments ready for the hostile, most dangerous deployment possible. Krieg is different. I'll let nobody tell you otherwise. And that's the story of Krieg. The Kriegsmen now serve as one of the most elite and disciplined units in the galaxy. There is something unique about them. So there are two things we need to talk about the Kriegsmen before we go on. And that's the culture that evolved and how their culture is perceived by other people. So, Krieg have something known as the cult of sacrifice. So basically, growing up in a world where all war is everything, right? The Kriegsmen have this sense of lacking. They believe that since their ancestors betrayed the Emperor, each one of them is less of a man for it. And the only way they can repay the Emperor's mercy and his graces and to, you know, atone for their sins is by dying on the battlefield. And people have said the Kriegs are suicidal. Kriegsmen are not suicidal. It's very important. The Kriegsmen actually believe that just putting a bullet in your head or running in front of a machine gun is actually worse. Sacrifice without meaning is just as bad. So like you need to sacrifice, you need to die serving the Emperor. Which is why I always use this example. If you tell a Kriegsman run in front of that machine gun, they'll be like, no. If you tell them, hey, here's this satchel charge, before you die, kill that machine gun, they'll be like, for the Emperor. Then they charge, they die, but it gets exploded. And that's the thing. A Kriegsman will have no problem charging an enemy defense line and taking 50% casualties so long as that defense line is held. So long as the goal is achieved, they don't mind the casualties involved. And that's, you know, where it comes from. That's where the strife comes from, that's where the misunderstanding comes from. Kriegsmen are not suicidal, but they don't really care if not all of them die, because like I said, again, they're very pragmatic. If 90% of the regiment gets wiped out, that regiment is no longer combat effective. So, you know, it just depends, really. They're pragmatists of the highest sense. Well, yeah, you know, they are opposed to doing some crazy shit like charging a bloodthirster with a shovel.
Hold up. Wait a minute.
Actual thing, not even kidding. Real life lore. More often than not, they're just very, very, very pragmatic. In fact, they have a very cold, calculated logic to them. So a far cry from the religious zealot fanatics that people often paint them as. Don't get me wrong, they're pretty religious and zealous, but again, in a cold, calculating fashion. If you want religious zealotry, check out the Sisters of the Battle of the Black Templars. You'll get plenty of religious zealotry there. Secondly, how do people view this? And how do the Kriegs view this? So that's not the Grim Dark. The Grim Dark is the fact that every single man in Krieg society is trained to be a soldier and is deployed as a soldier. There's no such thing as Krieg Reserve Corps or Krieg Home Guard or any well, there are Krieg regiments on Krieg that defend the planet, but if you're a Krieg Guardsman, you are going to fight and you are going to die for the Emperor. That's just plain and simple. And if you're a Krieg's woman, well, you're a factory worker for the rest of your life, and sometimes children. Depends. Yeah, Krieg don't really care. Sometimes you'll work, again, if you're a female child growing up or a regular kid who's too young to be inducted into the Guard, you're most likely going to be a factory worker. It depends. And as a Kriegswoman, you're going to be a factory worker for the rest of your life, and you're just there to work and have kids, really. It's very, very just like, yeah, it sucks, huh? You're either going to have to raise children alone as a factory worker while your husband is off dying somewhere. Which is very, very scary, but not in the way that you'd think. It's scary because that was World War I and World War II for an entire generation of women. You know, 4, 5, 6 years at a time. That's what all of them had to do. Which, yeah, that sucks. Yeah. Krieg is a combination of an army world, a fortress world, and a manufacturing world. They produce and arm their regiments completely, utterly, and entirely of vehicles, spaceships, everything. Like, Krieg is the definition of self-sufficient. And what's interesting is that the average age of deployment of a Kriegsman soldier is 18 to 20 years old. In some cases, 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds have even been. Again, it's World War I in space. So, like, in some cases, the average age was 18 to 20. You did have 16, 17-year-olds getting in. And more often than not, Krieg kids will lie about their age to enlist, just like World War I. And yeah, it's Krieg. It's very interesting to me because it's dark and depressing, but not in the way that people think. And I think the reason for that is because it so closely resembles our own history. Like, you look at Krieg in a nutshell, and I touched on it before, but that happened in real life. The Kriegsmen also have a very interesting idea on duty. Unless you're something like a Cadian, or a Mordian, or a Catachan, like the top 20 regiments, more often than not, they will be hostile, well, not physically hostile, but emotionally hostile to guard regiments that they believe are too weak to serve the Emperor. And they will tell you to your face, you are not worthy of serving the Emperor because you are not willing to take 50% casualties in this frontal assault. Unless they are the top regiments who can handle the Kriegsmen, who the Kriegsmen respect, usually there's going to be some problems. But more often than not, the Kriegsmen don't really care too much. Like, they won't make a fight about it. They'll just be like, yeah, you're not really good, Lamau, and carry on. But that is their outlook on duty and the call to sacrifice, as it's called. So, to summarize, the Kriegsmen do not throw away their lives carelessly. They do regard their lives in some high standing, but they regard the Emperor's wishes, the Emperor's desires, the Emperor's needs far and above their own lives. Makes sense? Grand. Right here. Now let's talk about the unique units of the Death Korps of Krieg. So, first thing first, we start with the Humble Guardsman. So the Humble Guardsman is clad in the stock standard uniform, including a pair of chemically treated trousers, a double-breasted greatcoat, thick heavy-duty leather boots, thick heavy-duty leather gloves, and each one of these particular items, as well as a shirt, obviously. All of these items are heavily treated in thick anti-chemical agents, meaning that the average Krieg guardsman, in combination with their most famous piece of equipment, one of them being their 3-pod gas mask, which is basically a 1-to-1 of the World War I gas mask translated into 40k, is completely immune to any and all chemical agents, minus those blessed by giant happy green's grandfather Satan over there, because, magic is, magic. And more often than not, a famous tactic employed by one of the units we'll cover later is to throw gas grenades into the opposition and charge through them, in combination with gas artillery or regular artillery. Kriegsmen are hardcore like that. So, he is also equipped with a plasteel helm, mark number 9, and he is armed with the Lucius Patton lasgun. Now, the Lucius Patton is interesting in that it is a semi-automatic rifle, however, each round has about 20% more punch than the standard las bolt, which suits the Kriegsmen just fine because they prefer disciplined rank and file. Again, it's leaning very heavily into the World War I theme and aesthetic. They're also armed with a 45 inch rather. Is it 45 inch or 45 centimeter? I will put it in here post credits. Sword bayonet. Again, it's basically a short sword that can also be used as a bayonet. And there are various other types of melee weapons that can be used, including knives, knuckle knives, trench clubs, trench shovels. And yes, people think that it's just a stupid meme, but the historical precedent is there. Many times, soldiers would sharpen their shovels to a point that they function much like an axe. You had to carry a shovel for entrenchment, and in the close quarters confines of a trench, a shovel was more advantageous than a bayonet attached to a rifle and dealt more damage than the bayonet by itself. Not to mention, it could also be used to clear out, foliage and stuff. It could be used as an axe, so it served multiple purposes. So having some Kriegsmen, not all of them, but some, using a sharpened shovel as an improvised melee weapon is incredibly low accurate. I mean, hell, they had German shock troops that were armed with literal breaching hammers, so there's that. And of course, he's equipped with the standard issue nonsense, that being bedroll, rations, cleaning kit, service kit, chemical kit, which is actually unique to the Death Korps because they have a unique kit to apply the chemical agents and whatnot. Yep, standard issue Death Korps infantryman. He is also armed with the standard issue flak armor. However, back in the day, they didn't have enough production to arm him with flak armor, so what they would do is they would just give him shoulder pads, or shoulder guards rather. That being so that they could display his regimental and unit number. But now in the modern era, they do indeed have. Some people say that they don't, because there are different conflicting pieces of lore, but from a logical standpoint, you were one of the most elite regiments in the galaxy. You will arm your soldiers with flak armor, at the very least. Like, Kriegsmen are not wasteful, they are pragmatic. It's stupid to me to think otherwise, that hey, we're not going to give our soldiers body armor here. Like, they have the means of production. I mean, hell, they're so valuable that they're willing to be cloned. You're going to give them body armor. That's neither here nor there. We then come to the next type, that being the Watchmaster. Now, the Watchmaster is essentially a sergeant. As the name implies, they are the master of the watch, but they're also a sergeant to the individual Krieg squadron. So the way that it works is Krieg squadrons, you have the squad, you then have the platoon, and then you then have the company into regiment. With one major difference. The standard Krieg units are hilariously bloated because they're designated as siege regiments. Siege regiment has its own connotation, but we'll get to that later. Basically, whenever you get something called a siege regiment, the numbers are incredibly bloated and they are trained in siege warfare. So while the average regiment may be anywhere from 3,000 all the way up to 25,000, depending on the guard regiment, the average Krieg regiment is more likely to be at about 100,000 men, give or take. We then come to the different types of regiments in the Krieg. Generally, regiments are composed into one of 3 varieties, and then those 3 varieties are composed into what is known as a line corps. Now, a line corps usually is about 5 regiments, give or take, but it could be more, it could be less, depending on the particular environment in which the Kriegsmen are situated. So we have line corps. Line corps are essentially infantry. They're standard infantry units. We then have armored regiments or armored corps. These are clad with mechanized infantry and heavy armor support, and they're designed for breakthroughs, etc., exploiting gaps, and they contain the shock troops of it. We then have the artillery regiment or the artillery corps or battery corps. These are primarily heavy artillery and used to support. We then also have the logistic units that are composed in logistic corps. Again, they're not really touched up upon that much, but they do exist because you need logistics to conduct a war. Interesting note, every single Krieg regiment is a combined armed regiment of some kind. You have line regiments. A line regiment will have about a company, give or take. Again, it depends on the particular unit, but about a company worth of artillery to be used, and again, that's relative. They'll have their own artillery, they'll have their own shock troops, they'll have their own armor, they'll have their own mechanized infantry. It's just that the percentage is far skewed. It's like an 80-20 split between the main purpose of a line regiment is to have line infantry, the main purpose of an armored regiment is to have armor and mechanized infantry, the main purpose of artillery is to have heavy artillery. And then we come to siege regiments. Now, siege regiments in particular are basically 3rd infantry, 3rd armor, 3rd regiments. These are not necessarily a dedicated formation, but much more an ad hoc formation combined for a particular purpose, but they do exist and are used by other regiments besides the Kriegsmen, siege regiments. So that's the basic structure and formation. Multiple corps will be combined into a Krieg army. Again, it follows basic military doctrine and principle and theory, just as I said, dramatically scaled. Remember, average regiment is about 100,000, give or take, because that's designed for losses. They're designed for attritional warfare. Then back to the specific units, we then have something called a Quartermaster. Now, a Quartermaster is a particular type of Krieg officer. Now, back in the days of the Civil War, equipment was worth more than lives. So the Quartermaster would take him and his aides and venture into no man's land and actually scavenge equipment from dead or dying soldiers. He would indeed try and salvage the soldier if possible, but if the soldier was too heavily wounded, or rather would cost too much resources to save, he would give him something called the Emperor's Mercy or the Emperor's Peace, which essentially is a bolt gun to the back of the head. Nowadays, they are far more forgiving, is if the Kriegsman had half of his insides ripped out by a bloodthirster or something. And the only time the battlefield execution will be conducted, they are the medics and again quartermasters. They are responsible for logisticians and medical duties, which kind of makes sense if you think about it, that you would combine a logistician with a medical officer, because if a medic does not have the essential supplies to perform surgery and take care of the wounded soldier, essentially useless. Now, that's the basic officer variety. The other officers are pretty simple: colonels, captains, etc. The colonels and captains are noted by their tall boots, stylized helms, and breastplates. Now, in some cases, these are just ceremonial plasteel breastplates, but in other cases, they can indeed be carapace, which is a heavier version of flak armor. We then come to the 3 specialized units and formations of the Death Corps of Krieg. First thing first, cavalry. These are known as the Death Riders of Krieg. Now, the Death Riders are cavalry that are armed and equipped with what are known as melter lances or frag lances. Frag lances being explosive tipped lances designed against infantry, melter lances being anti-armor tips. Now, you may be thinking, okay, what the fuck, Brad? These are cavalry in like 40k. You said they're pragmatic, but they're using cavalry. Like, what in the hell? Look at this horse. This is not a horse. This is more of a bear than a horse. Krieg steeds are genetically augmented and enhanced and designed that short of you blowing them up with a tank round, they're not going to die while they're riding. What that means is, while they are charging, they can get shot up. Like, there are accounts of them taking heavy bolter rounds, which is a 100 caliber, twice the size of a Marduce, to the chest, pulping the insides, but still being able to continue on the charge and smash into the enemy. These are incredibly far more tankier than you think. Not to mention that sometimes they are armed with armor to just increase their tankiness. People often underestimate the cavalry, but there is a quote by a famous tanker who said, the main gun of a tank is not the cannon, it is the machine gun. Because if you flank tanks, 9 times out of 10, they will die. So oftentimes, Krieg's cavalry are rarely used against armor in a full frontal assault. Against infantry, that's a completely different matter entirely. but more often than not they're used in a flanking role to flank armor and then use their high explosive melter tips to target the rear weaker armor of the tank crews, which has proved deadly and hilariously effective. So the standard Kriegsrider is equipped with the standard issue uniform as a Kriegsman, except they are often issued with a plasteel breastplate. Again, this is plasteel in some cases, or in some cases they have been carapace, again depending on the particular use of the Kriegsman. And fun fact, these particular Kriegsmen are the more forward thinking and the more independent thinking. It's often not Krieg riders will be needed to function on a dime. They are a reaction force in a sense to exploit gaps, to scout, etc. So an independent thinker is what's necessary. They're armed with a standard issue chipped lance with frag and melter tip, a chain sword usually, or a power sword, depending, usually a sergeant, and they're also armed with a las carbine and las pistol or auto pistol. We then come to the Grenadiers of the Death Korps of Krieg. These are the heavy-duty special assault infantry, the shock troops, if you will, of the Death Korps of Krieg. They're clad in carapace armor and they're armed with hotshot las guns as well as hotshot las pistols and enough grenades to ruin any bunker's day. Also, they tend to make great use of flamethrowers for obvious reasons. These are the heavy assault infantry. They are modeled directly after the assault infantry and special units of World War I. One thing in particular is that they tend to have what is known as the Death Head's Mask. They have skull mask on them, and this is a direct reference to the Totenkopfen or the Death's Heads shock trooper regiments of the Germans of World War I, as the Germans shock troops were the most prolific and most well known of them. Them alongside the Italian troops known as the Arditi were the most famous shock troopers of World War I. The British and French did employ shock troops, I believe, but they were not as successful or are just not as well known. But yeah, they are mechanized infantry and they're commonly used to exploit blade throughs made by the line infantry to direct assault heavily armored positions or to defend especially vulnerable areas. Shock infantry, Grenadiers. We then come to the final formation and my favorite formation, the combat engineers. Now, these particular units are combat engineers. Every regiment does indeed have combat engineers, but the Death Korps of Krieg are of a particular notoriety. They are clad in carapace armor and they are equipped with heavy shotguns with special crack rounds, which are heavy armor piercing rounds, as well as gas grenades. And they are used for exactly what combat engineers in World War I were used for: constructing tunnels, mining operations, fortifications, destroying enemy fortifications, sapping, and they are also used in some cases as breaching teams. A common tactic by the Death Korps of Krieg is to undermine enemy trench systems, explode them, and then chuck grenades out of them, these being gas grenades. Now imagine this, you're a heretic, an explosion happens in your trench, there's now a hole in your trench, your ears are ringing, next thing you know, grenades come up, then they're all filled with toxic gas. Then out of nowhere, this giant Death Korps of Kriegman armed with carapace armor comes out of nowhere and he's wielding a shotgun armed with a bayonet, which, mind you, is based off the trench gun of the American Marines of World War I, and just starts pumping round after round into you and your buddies, and your autogun does nothing against his carapace armor. They are my favorite because I just love the idea of a shotgun and gas grenades, and I'm a sucker for combat engineers, what can I say? But yeah, ladies and gentle people, that has been the Death Korps of Krieg in a nutshell. So to summarize, the Death Korps of Krieg are an incredibly tragic unit in of itself. They are heavily memed on by the community, and more often than not, memery translates into reality. But one thing I want you to take away from that, these guys are a representation of World War I in every aspect. They are a representation of the carnage, of the slaughter, but also of the mentality. Many of the men of World War I, young men, 16 even, boys, had this idea, this notion of duty to serve their country, to protect their people. It is an honorable sense, based in an honorable deed, of an honorable origin, used for nefarious purposes. The Imperium as a large takes this idea of redemption of the Death Korps and manipulates it and twists it to suit its own gain. And it's incredibly sad because these millions of men and women have relegated their lives to this soul-crushing nonsense. But the funny thing is, they're happy about it, which is mental to me. A Krieg guardsman genuinely believes that he is doing his best for the Emperor. A Krieg woman genuinely believes that she is doing her best for the Emperor in service of her family and her husband. Kriegsmen, ironically, are one of the happiest regiments. Now, often not, they are indeed dour in their characteristics and very melancholic, but for a Kriegsman, him dying there, a dying Kriegsman is one of the happiest people you can be in 40k, which is a very sobering thought. Two things to take away from this video. Kriegsmen are far more serious and far more complex than we give them credit for. Also, shovel memes do indeed exist. Alright, shovel meme is good meme, and shovel me in has reality. Also, Hanz says hello. But that's been all for me today. I've been General Bradley 101. You have been beautiful, awesome, and amazing people. Stay honest out there, boys and gals, and I will catch y'all next time. Dismiss, Rangers. Blessed by a giant and happy green father's giant Satan.